What if you could take a mountain of content, a full curriculum with hundreds of lessons, and transform it into a series of engaging training games in just a week or two? In today's case study, I'm going to show you exactly how I did that. So in this video, I'm going to give you the step-by-step process I used to see through an overwhelming content dump, identify the patterns that matter, and design targeted game templates that are based on the content so they help learners improve for real but save a ton of time and headaches in the process. And if you're new here, hi, my name is Mary Jo, and I've helped countless instructional designers transform their training through gamification. As a former video game producer, I can tell you that the most engaging learning experiences are the ones where the learners don't even realize they're being trained. So if you want to increase learner engagement but you're struggling to get away from cheap gimmicks, you might be a fit for my program, which is a roadmap that takes you from traditional teach then test e-learning to effective relevant gamification. So check that out below, and now let's dive in. So here's what happened. A language school came to me with the mandate of creating games to help their learners practice English as a second language. They wanted games to cover their entire curriculum, which had a ton of content, hundreds of lessons that cover everything in the English language, ranging from beginner to advanced. You probably deal with this all the time. I hear stories about departments that have huge libraries of PowerPoint courses and they want to overhaul everything and make it more engaging. That's intimidating, and in that situation, a lot of people decide that they're going to add Beyond videos to each course to make it more dynamic, one by one. Or they simply put in a reward system that will quote-unquote gamify things by giving rewards for completing the existing content, which otherwise remains unchanged. This is going to take forever, and this is insufficient, and in my experience, neither of them are really going to help the learner reach the learning objectives more easily. So here's what I did instead. I got the complete curriculum from the client and I went through most of it, but when I analyzed it, I noticed that every single lesson fell into one of three categories. First, some of the content was about learning a rule, like when to use this versus that, these versus those. There's a rule for that. You don't just pick either word willy-nilly. There's a logic to it. And once you understand it, you can apply it everywhere. The second type of content is rote memorization. So there are things in the English language that have no logical pattern. You just have to memorize it, like irregular past tenses. Walk becomes walked. Write becomes wrote, bring becomes brought. There's not much logic there, you just have to know these. And the third category was vocabulary, which is a different form of memorization, associating a word to a real-world object or concept. Three content types basically means that I only need to generate 3 game templates to cover all of this content. I ended up making more than 3 for variety and to better match some subcategories, but those are my 3 basic game types. And it's important to note that I didn't have to go through the entire library to extract these categories, just enough of the curriculum to be confident that everything was going to fall into one of those 3 categories. So now let me show you how I designed each game type, and pay attention to the fact that the content tells us what the game's going to be. Let's start with the learn a rule content. So let's say we're teaching when to use a versus an. A banana, an apple. Typically, to teach this to a non-English speaker, you would tell people the rule and then give them a couple of examples and then you'd test them on it. But because we want to get the learners active immediately and make them figure things out for themselves, we're not going to have these parts where they're passively receiving information. I pretty much always break down my games into introduce, practice, and assess. Figure out the rule, apply the rule, and then do it in real-world conditions. So how do I get them to figure out the rule here? Well, a simple way is to give them a bunch of examples. So I have a list of a words and an words, and I give them another word and I ask them to choose the right article for it, a or an. If they clue into the fact that all of these start with vowels and these with consonants, then they're going to get this one right, even if they've never seen this word before. And when that happens, they feel a lot more clever than if I just told them it's a goose, right? So they're active right away, right in the learning part. And to make sure that they didn't just luck out with a goose, I'm going to keep giving them words until they get, say, 5 of them in a row. That's practice. Now, if they don't get it after a few tries, I can eventually give them a hint, like what do all these words have in common? Point is, we're getting them to think it through. And if I want to, after they get a few of those right, I can cement it in their minds by letting them tell me what the rule is. Now they get to articulate what they figured out and they feel smart one more time because I never told them the answer up front. They discovered it through experimentation. So that's a this or that sort of game, and I can reuse that game for things like many versus much, a little versus few, etc. On this project, I found that I had quite a few rules that were about the order of words in a sentence, so I did end up making a game about that as well, but you've seen that one a couple of times, so we're just going to move on, and if you haven't seen it yet, I'm going to link it below. So once they've had the insight and they get the rule, they can apply it everywhere. They don't need endless practice. But for learning by rote content, you do need lots of practice. One example of rote memorization memorization is irregular plurals. Mouse, mice, goose, geese, sheep, sheep. There's no logical pattern for you to discover here, so we have to practice, and my focus is going to be on making that repetition feel rewarding. So again, I made a few of these games for variety, but the simplest one is the one where I have these pairs of plurals and they have to click them together to make them disappear. So the goal is to clear the whole board as quickly as possible. So the introduce loop is pretty easy because even if you don't know what the plural of ox is, you'll figure out that it's oxen because oxen looks like ox. Same for mouse and mice. You'll get those correctly easily, but that's okay. We're teaching you right now, actively. In the practice loop, we're increasing the difficulty. Now that you've seen the irregular plurals, I'm going to start introducing some attractive decoys. So now there's mouse, mice, mouses, and mouse. So now you have to remember that the correct one is mice. I can also weave in some new words like wolf and wolves. And I'll even throw in some regular plurals just to keep them on their toes. Cat, cats, bear, bears. In my assess loop, I'm going to try to make it as hard as real life because that's the final challenge before they face real life. So in this case, it could be something like taking away all the options and just getting them to write out the plural as fast as possible. So this mini game turns the memorization into a challenge with a clear progression. There's variety of gameplay built right into my active learning string here. We're not just drilling irregular plurals in a list. The key is to make each repetition feel slightly different so that they don't get bored while building up their automatic recall. And of course, this is a game that can be reused for other rote learning like past tenses. Bring brought, ring wrote, sing sang, etc. This is just one of the ways you can teach actively, and if you want the entire library of tactics, again, you can check out my program. For vocabulary, I decided that I wanted a couple of different game approaches just for variety. The first game focused on quick recognition. I show a word and I have the learners select the correct image for it, and you try to get as many as you can in the time given. At different levels of difficulty, you'll have more or less time to get through the whole list. Once I've built this game about animals, I can reuse it for everything. Tools, clothing, body parts, etc. I also decided to make a game where you would see the object in the context of a real life scene. So here you have to pick the right parts of this image in the order that the words are presented. If you get stuck, you can use a skip power up to pick another word at random, and hopefully that one will be easier for you. For all of these games, the key insights are that it's the structure of your content that tells you what games to make. This game wouldn't work to teach that mouse becomes mice, goose becomes geese. And the other insight is that you always want to give the learner a way to figure things out for themselves. So once the games are designed, I had to show them to the client. And obviously, if you follow this channel, you know that I didn't make a presentation. I didn't give her a design doc to read. She got a playable prototype. I put the mouse in her hands and she started playing. As soon as I start having an idea for a game type, I open up Storyline and I start building a working prototype of it. The goal of the prototype is to showcase the basic functionality, just enough to test and demonstrate that it's actually fun and it's teaching the right things. When I show it to the client, it's not usually very polished. I usually focus on making it just clear and understandable. Some games do require graphics to be understandable, so for those I do include pictures right at the prototype stage, but on the games that don't require images, I don't put them in just for decoration. So once the prototypes are working and approved, and I know how I'm going to make each game easier or harder, now it's time to scale. So here it's just a matter of taking my templates and swapping out the content and producing hundreds of mini games, each using the right template for that content type. So handling all of this content doesn't mean creating hundreds of different games. Instead, you just create a few smart templates that can handle all your content. Now, in this particular case, each mini game was standalone on their LMS. Learners could play them between classes for extra practice. But if you wanted to, you could make each of them a level in a larger game with a progression. That's when you add a macro structure on top of these templates. If you want a sense of progression and longer term goals, you could lock advanced levels until learners demonstrate proficiency on the basics. And if you want a narrative, although I never seem to do that, you can thread a story through the games. And if you want to give the learner some choices, you can create sandbox areas where they can practice freely as much as they want. What's important is that your core gameplay is done first and it's relevant and effective. Do not worry about this macro structure stuff or narrative or motivational mechanics until you know your gameplay is doing what it's supposed to do, which is accelerate the learners towards the learning objectives. That's the key to making gamification work for you, as opposed to just making things seem gamified. So the next time a client dumps 200 slides on you and asks for engagement, you got this. Just look at it through the lens of systems. Analyze the content structure, identify the repeating learning patterns, design templates for each one, prototype quickly, and then scale. When you get saddled with a content library like this, it can be tempting to just default to a one-size-fits-all approach. This, however, is the middle ground between one-size-fits-all, which usually means one-size-fits-nothing, and doing everything piecemeal. You get to decide where you'll sit on this spectrum. I determined that I needed a minimum of 3 games, but I ended up making about 10 variations, and those variations allowed me to cover hundreds of lessons. And if you want to master this systematic approach to gamified e-learning, check out the Effective Gamification framework. It walks you step by step through analyzing any content, designing the challenges that make learners think, so that you're working smarter, not harder. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.